The winter wind howled, whipping through the banners in the Jin army's camp. A lone rider in the distance, body stiff and numb from the cold, felt a surge of strength return as he urged his horse forward toward the camp. For 4 months, the Jin army had besieged Zhezhou, yet the defending general remained resolute, shutting the gates and refusing to engage. And so, the standoff dragged on. Near the center of the camp, a group of Silver Spear soldiers were gathered, gambling to pass the time. Seeing the rider enter, they called out, "How is the Inspector General's health?" The rider parted his lips, but the cold wind rushed into his throat, chilling him from the inside out. They were referring to his foster father, Cheng Yi. Cheng Ju shook his head slightly. "It's an old illness." He pointed toward the Central Command tent. "I have something to report. I won't disturb you." As they watched Cheng Ju's figure retreat, one soldier lowered his voice. "If the Inspector General dies, I fear we'll have trouble with the army's provisions." It wasn't an unfounded concern. With the previous dynasty's fall, the absence of a central authority had fueled increasing strife among the military governors. Though a eunuch, Cheng Yi had been skilled at raising troops and amassing supplies. While the former king waged war, the affairs of state had been left entirely in Cheng Yi's hands. Years ago, Prime Minister Fu Wen, in alliance with the Huaixi garrison, orchestrated a purge of the eunuchs. Cheng Yi had fled under cover of night with his foster son, seeking refuge with the Jin king, to whom he had since dedicated his utmost loyalty. Under Cheng Yi's guidance, Cheng Ju had not only mastered military strategy, but had also received a scholar's education. The soldiers, though warriors, had benefited from Cheng Yi's influence and held no contempt for him despite his status as a eunuch. At the mention of his illness, concern flickered across their faces. Yet, as the dice rolled once more, their worries were soon forgotten. As Cheng Ju lifted the tent's entrance flap, a gust of cold air slipped inside. He was not tall, his frame slender. With a sidestep, he moved past the fabric, allowing it to fall back in place. At the head of the tent, the Jin king looked up, his youthful face betraying a hint of surprise. He rose to his feet slowly. "You've returned early. How is the Inspector General?" Cheng Ju said, "Not well." Seeing the Jin king's brows crease slightly, he lowered his gaze. "My foster father knows he doesn't have much time left. Military affairs take precedence. He told me to return without delay." A soft sigh came from the head of the tent. After a long pause, the king's deep voice finally spoke. "The people of Zhezhou are besieged. In 5 days, their food will run out." Cheng Ju lifted his eyes. A flicker of admiration passed through the king's gaze. "They will surrender. Cheng Ju, when the city falls, what reward do you seek?" He had no shortage of capable generals or elite troops. Yet, when planning this siege, it was Cheng Ju who had suggested cutting off supply routes rather than launching a direct assault, while sending small detachments to harass the defenders. Zhezhou would crumble on its own. At the words of praise, a faint smile flickered at Cheng Ju's lips. The next day, the people of Zhezhou threw their general's severed head from the city walls. The gates swung open, welcoming the Jin army inside. Zhezhou was absorbed into the Jin kingdom. 5 days later, Cheng Yi passed away. Facing the wind, Cheng Ju knelt and bowed in mourning for a long time. With Zhezhou secured, the army marched on toward Luzhou. The people of Luzhou were fierce, their governor, Gao Yanbin, a master archer. Despite having only one eye, he could strike his target among thousands with deadly accuracy. Yet, for all their strength, Luzhou, too, eventually fell. On the day of its capture, the Jin army looted the city. Wherever the Jin king's whip pointed, not a single Luzhou soldier was spared. Blood soaked into the earth, staining it so deeply that even 10 years later, its color remained. Cheng Ju neither saw this, nor heard the words that would later be known across the land. Luzhou is worth less than Cheng Ju alone. On the battlefield, Luzhou's cavalry had broken through the encirclement, cornering the Jin king with only a handful of guards. Cheng Ju, armed with a silver spear, struck down his enemies, his cold steel drinking deep from their throats. Then, from the distance, an arrow flew. Gao Yanbin's arrow, cutting through the chaos, aimed directly at its mark. At the last moment, Chengju rode forward. The arrow struck true, piercing through his left shoulder and pinning him to the ground. When the Silver Spear troops arrived, they found the Jin King drenched in blood, his eyes blazing with fury. Standing before Chengju's fallen form, he swung his spear in a sweeping arc, carving a crimson path through the battlefield. Through the haze of pain, Chengju could barely make out the king's figure. His vision blurred. A slight movement sent agony lancing through his shoulder. With the enemy held at bay, the Jin King finally knelt beside him. His silver armor was splattered in blood, glinting coldly in the sunlight. Gripping the arrow's shaft, he pulled. Chengju stifled a cry, his teeth sinking into his lip until the flesh tore. The Jin King hoisted him onto his horse and led the retreat. The healer approached to remove the arrow. Though fading in and out of consciousness, Chengju managed to speak. "Your Highness, there's no need for all this trouble. Just do me a favor." Silence fell over the room. Then, to the shock of all present, Chengju pushed away those supporting him, staggered forward, and he let himself fall. The impact drove the arrow deeper, forcing the embedded shaft to shift outward. The Jin King stepped forward. Bending down, he grasped the protruding arrow and pulled. Chengju's sweat-drenched face twisted in pain. His lips, already bloodied, turned even paler as the taste of iron filled his mouth. The arrow, slick with blood and torn flesh, was cast aside. The Jin King's expression darkened, his voice tight with anger. "Everyone leave." Once they were alone, he snarled, "Chengju, do you have no regard for your own life?" That arrow had been meant for him. Chengju lay limp, his garments soaked through with blood. A faint, weary smile played at his lips. "My father and I owe the Jin family everything. A mere arrow is nothing. Even if I had to face 1,000 blades, I would accept my fate without complaint." The Jin King helped him onto a couch. "Let's set past debts aside. You won Zizhou and shielded me from an arrow. For these two merits alone, how should I reward you, Chengju?" Closing his eyes briefly, Chengju remained silent. His origins as a southerner had always set him apart from the Jin army's warriors. With his eyes shut, the faint tremor of his lashes lent him an air of delicacy. A thought crossed the king's mind. Had his subordinates been fond of men, Chengju would not have been spared. Sensing something, Chengju's dark eyes fluttered open, glistening despite his pallor. Meeting the king's gaze, he spoke. 8,000 miles of rivers and mountains, I will guard them by your side." The Jin King was momentarily stunned. Then he laughed aloud. Pride radiated from him, sharp as a blade, his chin lifting ever so slightly. For the first time, his piercing gaze softened. "Then may we never betray each other." On the day of the beginning of spring, Prince Jin led his army back to the city. The late king had always been generous to his soldiers, but ever since Prince Jin ascended the throne, he changed this approach entirely. Those among the troops who harbored resentment and plotted rebellion were all ruthlessly suppressed. Severed heads were hung on wooden fences, left to be dried by the bitter winter wind. And behind it all, there was Chengju. Since the troubled middle years of the previous dynasty, the nation's rise and fall had often depended on military governors. They were the backbone in times of crisis, yet they also became the root of chaos and downfall. Initially, the land was divided into 7 factions. The largest of these commanded over 10 provinces, while even the smallest still controlled 3 or 4. Each military governor claimed to be restoring order in the name of revival, but in truth, their ambitions lay in seizing the 9 tripods, the symbol of imperial power. Jin had risen from Bing and Dai. By the late king's time, he already held control over more than 10 military districts. In the years since, under Prince Jin's rule, their territory had only expanded further. Now, with the brothers of Huai and Si turning against each other, their decline was evident. The generals of Yan had been proud and unruly since the previous dynasty, frequently replacing their commanders. The ruler of Shu was foolish, relying only on natural barriers for defense. As for the rest, they were hardly worth mentioning. Looking across the land, none could truly rival Jin anymore. More and more voices urged Prince Jin to declare himself emperor. During a drunken feast, someone once again raised this subject. This time, it was brought up by Yu Yanchang. Yu Yanchang was a valiant warrior, once treated by the late king as a son. When Prince Jin took the throne, Yu voluntarily changed his surname, earning the prince's deep trust. Prince Jin leaned on his armrest and smiled, just about to speak, when suddenly, chaos erupted. Chengju, who had been sitting quietly, suddenly threw a punch, landing it squarely on Yu Yanchang's face. Yu reeled from the unexpected strike, his face immediately turning red. Before he could react, Chengju overturned the small table in front of him, drew his sword, and moved to cut Yu down. The surrounding officials rushed to intervene. Chengju cursed furiously. Yu Yanchang is nothing but a lowly horse herder from the north. He speaks no words of loyalty and dares to flatter like a sycophant. He violently shook off the hands restraining him. Your Highness and your father fought in blood for 20 years, not for vanity, but to cleanse the disgrace of our homeland and restore the nation. Huai and Si are not yet subdued, yet you already consider taking the imperial title? This is not our original purpose. It would be a betrayal of all expectations. Yu Yanchang speaks such treacherous words. He deserves to die. As soon as he finished, Yu Yanchang, now enraged, kicked him hard in the ribs. Blessed with natural strength, Yu's strike sent Chengju sprawling onto the ground. A sharp pain surged through his chest, and he coughed up a mouthful of blood. Prince Jin rose from his seat, his gaze dark and unreadable, a trace of displeasure in his expression. Yu Yanchang is drunk. This matter will not be discussed further. The feast ends here. With those words, he was shielding Chengju. The officials exchanged glances. Someone tugged at Yu Yanchang's sleeve, and though he shot a furious glare at Chengju, he eventually stormed out in anger. Chengju slowly picked himself up, dusted off his robes, his expression unchanged, but his hand remained pressed against his ribs. Prince Jin asked, "Did you fall badly?" Chengju shook his head lightly. "Your Highness, regarding the matter of claiming the throne." The man raised a hand, signaling him to stop. A smile lingered at his lips, yet his eyes were cold. "I understand your meaning. Once I have pacified the remaining factions, I will seek out the descendants of the previous dynasty. If none remain, I will take the throne. But if any survive, who would dare challenge me? For now, my claim would lack legitimacy." A glint of murderous intent flashed in his eyes. Yu Yanchang is illiterate and relies solely on brute strength. Chengju finished the thought for him, which means someone put him up to this. Prince Jin raised his cup and drained the last of his wine. 3 months later, he executed his uncle, Kagong. What followed was a flood of rumors. Rumors could be ignored, but never truly silenced. When Chengju heard himself labeled a sycophant, he merely chuckled and let it pass. He continued his usual routine, carefully applying powder in his residence. His fingers were long and slender, completely different from last winter when frostbite had left them swollen and red. Year after year, after every bath, he followed the same ritual. No one else was allowed to assist. Face, neck, behind the ears, every detail had to be attended to, crafting a complexion deliberately sallow. A letter arrived from Yen, offering peace and proposing a marriage alliance. Chengju advised Prince Jin, hide weapons within the bridal carriage, disguise elite soldiers as bearers, and seize Songzhou under the guise of the wedding procession. Prince Jin agreed and had already sent word to Yen that he would personally escort the bride. Chengju smiled at his reflection in the mirror. The figure in the glass returned the smile. He rose slowly. Outside, the night had deepened. The heavens above bore no stars, only endless darkness blanketing Jin's lands. But one day, dawn would break, and the world would see the light. He lay down on his bed and slowly closed his eyes. Yan King Lu Shou personally hosted a feast, drinking with Prince Jin. Lu Shou had once been a mere foot soldier in the Yan army. Through military merit, he rose to the rank of elite guardsman. Dissatisfied with his rewards, the elite guards mutinied, killing their commander and proclaiming Lu Shou as their leader. By then, the previous dynasty had already fallen, and Lu Shou declared himself king of Yan. Though Yan's people were impoverished, Lu Shou himself was immensely wealthy. The reason was simple. During his conquests, he had ordered his men to plunder the imperial tombs of the fallen dynasty. Only the towering Zhao Mausoleum remained untouched. The other 16 tombs were desecrated, yielding countless treasures of jade and gold. The bride sent to marry Prince Jin was Lu Shou's sister, Lu Fu. The moment Lu Fu entered, she captured the attention of every man present. Her dark hair was coiled like clouds, her waist slender and graceful. Beneath delicately arched brows, her eyes shimmered with liquid warmth, a beauty capable of toppling empires. She lowered herself in a demure bow. When she raised her face again, Qingju instinctively let his right hand drop, concealing the wine that had spilled onto his sleeve. He glanced at Prince Jin. The latter was rubbing his temples, his smile faint yet enigmatic. Qingju's heart sank. A torrent of thoughts surged through his mind, twisting into a single, unspoken realization. So, she was Lu Fu. 2 years ago, during a military campaign, Prince Jin had glimpsed a woman in the mountains, a fleeting vision of beauty. His words from that day echoed in Qingju's ears. If I were to rule the world, I would have that woman. Now, she stood before them, even more stunning than she had been then. Qingju lowered his gaze, hiding the turmoil in his eyes. Lu Shou suddenly mentioned Qingju's name. I have long heard that the Prince of Jin has many wise men under his command. Seeing it today, I must say, indeed. He leaned sideways and clapped his hands. A servant presented a scroll. Lu Shou smiled. This is an authentic work of the sage of calligraphy. We warriors are but crude men, unfit to appreciate such beauty. As the saying goes, a precious sword befits a hero. Today, I shall gift it to Judge Cheng. Qingju had recently been promoted to the rank of circuit judge, hence Lu Shou addressed him as such. Qingju stared at the scroll, his body stiffening, unable to respond. The Prince of Jin observed him and spoke coolly. There are no such artifacts in Jin. Judge Cheng loves calligraphy. He is simply entranced. Not only did Jin lack such treasures, but in all the land, where else could one find them? This was a burial piece from the imperial tombs of the previous dynasty, long resting beneath the earth, and yet now it had fallen into Lu Shou's hands. His tongue felt bitter as he finally found his voice. I humbly thank your highness of Yan for this gift. As the banquet continued, Lu Shou grew tipsy. Musicians performed military farces, drawing laughter from the guests. Qingju laughed as well. He had always been reserved, but perhaps the joy of obtaining such a rare treasure loosened his restraint. He drank without pause, enough that even the Prince of Jin cast him a few more glances. By the time they retired for the night, he was already staggering, clutching the scroll tightly in his arms. Once back in his quarters, alone at last, his drunken gaze regained some clarity. He dared not light incense, only washed his hands repeatedly with clear water. Then, he carefully unfurled the scroll. He did not look at the calligraphy. His eyes were fixed solely on the seals below. He gazed and gazed, he did not know for how long. A drop of water fell onto the ink. The ink bled outward, and with trembling fingers, he gently traced the private seals of the emperors through the ages. He did not sleep that night. At dawn the next day, he sought an audience with the Prince of Jin. The day of the wedding arrived swiftly, and the city rejoiced in grand celebration. That very night, Jin's forces entered Songzhou, capturing Lu Shou and slaughtering his 3,000 household guards. The corpses piled high, and the moat ran red with blood. With a blade at his throat, Lu Shou's eyes burned with fury as he shouted the prince of Jin's name. Morong Ling, you despicable scoundrel. The prince of Jin's robes were torn, but beneath his wedding attire, he wore armor. His expression remained unchanged, seated high above. It was Chengju who spoke. Lu Shou, you were but a commoner of Yan who usurped power and declared yourself commander. That is disloyalty. You plundered imperial tombs. That is dishonor. A man who is both disloyal and dishonorable, what right does he have to rebuke others? Lu Shou sneered. And you, a lowly eunuch, dare to spout such arrogance. Suddenly, there was a commotion outside. Guards dragged in Lu Fu. Her phoenix crown was still upon her brow, and upon seeing her brother's plight, she rushed forward, tears rolling down her delicate cheeks. Lu Shou flinched. The blade at his throat pressed closer. Lu Fu cried out, "What crime has my brother committed to deserve this?" A beauty in tears was like a flower battered by rain. But Lu Shou spoke then, his voice steady. "Morong Ling, let us make a trade." The man seated above cast him a glance, lips parting slightly. "Speak." Lu Shou looked at his sister, love flashing through his gaze before he composed himself. "The treasures I took from the imperial tomb remain hidden. I will trade them for her safety, a life of wealth and peace. But you must swear it." Chengju spoke slowly. "Do you truly believe that if you do not reveal the location, we of Jin cannot find it ourselves?" Lu Shou laughed madly, eyes locking onto Chengju's. "If you doubt me, feel free to try." He knew the value of the bargain he was offering. After a long silence, the Prince of Jin pulled 3 arrows from his quiver. "I, Morong Ling, swear this day not to kill Lu Fu and to ensure her wealth and safety." He then broke the arrows and cast them before Lu Shou. Sworn upon an arrow, never to be broken. Lu Shou revealed the treasure's location. Knowing he would not live, he threw himself onto the blade, ending his own life. Lu Fu let out a pained cry, finally rushing to her brother's body. She cradled him, weeping bitterly, pressing her hands against his wounded throat, but it was futile. Moments later, a soldier entered with a report, requesting the Prince of Jin to inspect the treasury. He left with his men, leaving only Chengju and a few guards in the room. Chengju ordered coldly, "Separate them." Soldiers pulled Lu Fu to her feet. "Take her away, and guard her well," he commanded. Then he knelt on one knee and slowly raised his hand. At the doorway, Lu Fu turned back just in time to see the scene. Her heart shattered as she screamed, "No!" Chengju's sword whistled through the air. Blood splattered across his face and clothes, his expression obscured by shadow. He lifted Lu Shou's severed head and tossed it to a soldier. "Feed it to the dogs." Lu Fu, restrained, stared at him with seething hatred, her eyes burning with fury. Hate him? Then let her hate. It was he who had devised the plan to destroy Yan. If she lived, hatred was inevitable. He had once hated someone just as deeply, wishing to tear them apart and devour their flesh. Chengju stepped out into the night. Let her hate him all she wanted. He would be waiting. The night before Jin's forces reached Huaixi, Chengju entered the Prince of Jin's war tent. At that time, Lu Fu was by the prince's side, having become his concubine. Seeing Chengju enter, she knew there was business to discuss and silently withdrew. Chengju smiled. The Prince of Jin raised a brow. "What is so amusing?" He replied, "Your Highness has recently gained a beauty. Naturally, that is worth smiling about." It had been 2 years since the fall of Yan. In all that time, there had been only Lu Fu at the prince's side. What was new about it? The prince pondered this, then voiced the thought aloud. He scrutinized Chengju. Tonight, there was something different about him. Then, Chengju's typically hoarse voice took on an unexpectedly sweet lilt. "Your Highness, do you not consider me a beauty?" The Prince of Jin froze. Before his eyes, Chengju's long hair cascaded down, revealing delicate, exquisite features. Her lips, though untouched by rouge, were naturally red, impossible to look away from. She knelt, lowering her head, appearing completely at his mercy. From above, the sight of her slender, fair neck was utterly captivating. His mind wavered, and he moved, lifting her chin. The touch of her skin was smooth as silk. Holding her jaw, his tone was unreadable. When did my judge become a woman? Chengju did not flinch, meeting his gaze. My godfather was indeed my godfather, but I was never his son. My father was the Minister of Rites in the former dynasty, a friend of my godfather's. When Huaixi took the emperor hostage, my father followed, only to be drowned in the Bian River along with the other court loyalists. If not for my godfather saving me, I would have long since become a wandering ghost in the waters of Bian. The hand beneath her chin loosened slightly. She smiled. Your Highness is often asked what reward I desire, and I have never answered. Now, I have made up my mind and come to claim it. What do you want? Your Highness's bed. He lifted her into his arms. She closed her eyes, her long lashes fluttering like a butterfly's wings. A familiar voice murmured at her ear, "As you wish." Few men could resist a beautiful woman, especially one who was not only beautiful, but also brilliant. That night, Chengju did not leave. The dim light in the tent cast a soft glow on the woman's figure. Her long hair cascaded over her chest, concealing the alluring sight beneath, yet unable to hide the traces of kisses scattered across her shoulders and neck. The man's desire still lingered in his gaze as he leaned on one arm, absent-mindedly playing with a strand of her hair. A scar marred her shoulder, a relic from years ago, earned during the campaign to pacify Lu Yu. Intelligent and beautiful, Chengju was the embodiment of all virtues a woman could possess. He asked, "Why reveal your identity only now?" She replied, "Had I done so earlier, Your Highness would have taken me as a concubine, not a trusted minister. Had I waited until after the fall of Huaixi town, Your Highness would have suspected me of harboring ulterior motives, using myself as a rare commodity to be bargained with. Not too soon, not too late, now was just the right moment." She spoke these words beneath him. Murong Ling pressed a kiss to her forehead. His lips were hot, and she rose slightly to meet him, reciprocating his touch. With the fall of Huaixi town, the north was unified. Various regions sent memorials urging the Prince of Jin to ascend the throne. Finding no surviving descendants of the previous dynasty, the Prince of Jin established a new reign, naming his dynasty Yanjin, and the first year of his rule Tongguang. All the loyal officials and generals who had served him were granted titles. But what stirred the people of Jin the most was the revelation that the former circuit judge, Chengju, was in fact a woman, and she had now entered the emperor's harem. In the first year of Tongguang, during the 7th month, the court was embroiled in fierce debate over the issue of selecting an empress. The old comrades who had fought alongside the emperor believed that Consort Cheng's merits warranted her being named empress. Meanwhile, the newly surrendered generals of the various regions opposed this, citing Chengju's tarnished reputation and favoring Lu Fu instead. On the surface, it seemed like a dispute over the empress's title. In reality, it was the first political battle between the old ministers and the new officials following the establishment of the new dynasty. Amidst this courtly struggle, Chengju remained unruffled in the harem. There was, however, one person who had kept entirely out of these muddy waters, the current Grand Chancellor, Dai Qin. As the head of the Grand Secretariat, Dai Qin held authority over military and state affairs. His position was not inherited from his distinguished family, but earned through his own capability. The Dai family had produced officials for generations in the previous dynasty, boasting a lineage of high rank. However, by his father's time, the family had faded somewhat, with his father serving as a mere scholarly official, holding the position of Grand Tutor. During the Bianshui incident, where the court was purged, Dai Qin's father survived because he had been in mourning for his late mother, staying in his hometown. Dai Qin initially served under the Liang dynasty but, following its collapse, switched allegiance to Jin. After years of service and promotion, he was eventually appointed as commander of the Inner Palace Guards. Upon the founding of Jin, he was elevated to the position of Grand Chancellor, prudent and meticulous by nature. Holding such an esteemed post, he naturally avoided unnecessary remarks. Were he in Dai Qin's position, he too would choose to preserve himself. Yet there was perhaps another reason why Dai Qin refrained from involving himself in the empress selection. Others might not know, but as a descendant of a prominent official from the former dynasty, how could Dai Qin be oblivious? The so-called daughter of the Grand Minister of Rites was merely a convenient cover, banking on the fact that no one from the old days remained to dispute it. Others might be fooled, but not him. On the night of May 14th, an unexpected knock sounded at the Dai residence. The messenger's words were succinct, only 4 syllables. A noble guest approaches. An hour later, Chengju appeared before Dai Qin. She wore a loose cloak, its hood partially concealing her face. She asked, "I have long heard of Lord Dai's filial devotion. Forgive my intrusion, but may I have an audience with your esteemed father?" Dai Qin declined with courtesy, citing his father's frail health and the fact that he had already taken his medicine and retired for the night. Chengju smiled. "You need only relay my request. I am an old acquaintance of your father. Whether he sees me or not is his decision." After about the time it takes to brew a pot of tea, Dai Qin's father emerged, supported by his son. He had a chronic ailment in his legs and required assistance to enter the study. Chengju stood with her hands clasped behind her back. Hearing movement behind her, she reached up and removed her hood and veil. Dai Qin called out her name. Chengju slowly turned around. Gone was the confident woman who had confronted Dai Qin earlier. In a gentle voice, she asked, "Lord Dai, it has been many years. How is your health?" Dai Qin watched as his father froze. The once strict old man's eyes reddened, his lips trembling as if to speak. The next moment, he pushed his son aside and attempted to kneel before Chengju, but she caught him with a firm grip. Her own emotions surged, tears rolling down her collar. Years had passed, and old friends had become scarce. The study echoed with the sorrowful cries of an aged man. He wept, saying, "I should have died for my country that day. I never thought I would live to see you again." Chengju was not the daughter of the Grand Minister of Rites. During the fall of the old dynasty, Huaixi town had taken the emperor hostage and massacred the court eunuchs. The imperial family itself teetered on the edge of ruin. The crown prince was slain in his residence. Meanwhile, she had been smuggled out by the empress, given a new name and identity, and forced to flee with the eunuch Qingyi. The last princess of the dynasty, bearing the title of Yong'an, had perished alongside her parents, poisoned by their captors. The young girl who had fled with Chengyi had been nothing more than a powerless court eunuch's ward. Years of bloodshed could not erase the looming shadow of death. Whenever she closed her eyes, memories resurfaced. The indulgent gaze of her older brother, the furrowed brows of her father, the tear-streaked face of her mother, and the dying whispers of her foster father, Chengyi. She had to live, to bear the weight of a nation's vengeance. Awakening from these thoughts, Chengju wiped away her tears. Taking a step back, she solemnly bowed before Dai Qin's father. The old man recoiled in alarm. "Your Highness, you must not. The Yong'an princess of the previous dynasty has long since perished. The woman before you now is merely a consort of the new emperor," she said, her gaze shifting to Dai Qin. "I have come tonight with a request." Dai Qin stiffened, his pulse quickening. Feigning ignorance, he asked, "What do you mean?" Chengju spoke softly, but her voice was firm. "Recommend me as empress." She articulated each word clearly, her earlier vulnerability erased, replaced by unwavering resolve. Dai Qin's mind reeled. A strategist without equal stood before him. The harem was never her battlefield. Her ambitions stretched far beyond. Chengju arrived discreetly and wished to leave just as quietly. Dai Pan remained in the study, making no move to see him off. As he recalled Chengju's meaningful gaze before leaving, he heard his father ask, "Do you still not understand?" He turned to look at his father. His father sighed and said, "Consort Cheng is pregnant." She placed her hand over her lower abdomen 3 times, yet you didn't notice even once. Dai Pan's hand, which had been wiping the sweat from his forehead, froze in midair. He suddenly understood. Consort Cheng's pregnancy was the best bargaining chip in the battle for the Empress's position. Even without his support, she could still ascend to the throne. However, with his advice, her path to becoming Empress would be even smoother. That was the first point. Demonstrating her methods to those who opposed her was the second. Gaining him a useful blade was the third. She came to him in the dead of night, revealing her identity, which could mean only 2 things. Either she was certain he wouldn't refuse, or she had a backup plan regarding his origins. She had calculated not just the first step, but the second and third as well, leaving nothing to chance. He let out a bitter laugh and asked his father, "When you saw her at court back then, was she already like this?" His father swirled the cold tea in his cup gently. It was a long moment before he finally spoke. No one is born brilliant. Back then, the Yong'an princess was still the foolish child in the hands of the emperor and empress. Even as the empire teetered on the edge of collapse, under the protection of the imperial couple, she could still retain a bit of innocence and joy. Minister Dai coughed a few times, recalling the past, a wave of bitterness washing over him. The late emperor had not been an incompetent ruler, and the crown prince had been exceptionally gifted. But when an empire is on the brink of ruin, there is no one who can turn the tide. Slowly, he pushed himself up, his posture already hunched with age. Buried along with the dynasty were not just the sovereigns, but also his old friends, his peers, and his kin. Back in those days, when they were fresh-faced scholars who had just passed the imperial exam, riding fast horses through Chang'an in high spirits, what a glorious time it had been. Never would they have imagined that, 20 years later, the grand streets of the capital would be lined with the bones of fallen ministers. Minister Dai reached out to push open the door, stepping over the threshold with effort. His back curved even more sharply in the night. The day of the Empress's enthronement was marked by fine weather. Her dragon and phoenix headdress was adorned with 9 dragons and 4 phoenixes, dazzling in its brilliance, radiating an almost blinding splendor. With each step she took, the jade ornaments on her attire chimed melodiously, crisp and clear. The ceremonial robe of the Empress was only worn for grand occasions such as investitures and court assemblies. She had seen her mother wear it once, long ago. Back then, she had stared longingly at the 5-colored pheasant embroidery on her mother's robe. Her elder brother, the crown prince, had caught her gaze and laughed aloud, saying, "If you want to look, then look well. After all, you'll never wear it yourself." "Royal brother, I have finally donned the ceremonial robe. A princess of a fallen kingdom, now the empress of a new dynasty." Sunlight poured down from the clouds, so bright that it was almost blinding. Amidst the resounding cheers, Chengju stood above all. The people below couldn't see her expression clearly, nor did they notice the slight upward curve of her lips. A fleeting smile, as if relieved. 5 months later, the Empress gave birth to a son. When His Majesty arrived at Fenghua Palace, Chengju was playing with the child. She held a small rattle in front of him, shaking it gently to catch his attention. His dark eyes gleamed like polished glass. Murong stepped forward to take a look. Time had treated this man kindly. Compared to when they first met, the youthful inexperience had faded, replaced by an unmistakable imperial bearing. Their child bore his resemblance. He reached out to tap the baby's forehead. The child's lips trembled, on the verge of crying. Chengju quickly placed a cloth tiger beside him. Murong said, "You're spoiling him too much." She continued to amuse the child while glancing at him sideways. Then, with a smile, she said to her son, "If father doesn't dote on you, mother will." Behind her, Murong spoke. At court today, some ministers proposed naming Zheng as the crown prince. Her hands froze for a moment before she casually replied, "A 5-month-old child. What could they possibly see in him? Besides, your majesty is still in your prime. Whoever submitted that memorial should be dragged out and given a beating." A weight settled on her shoulder. It was his hand, pressing down with some force. His voice was low as he asked, "Do you mean it?" She kept her back to him. "Does your majesty think I don't? Have you forgotten the 8 words you once said? May the bond of ruler and subject never be broken. I have never failed you, your majesty. What about you?" He reached from behind to pinch her cheek. "Such a sharp tongue. You always have a comeback." Only then did Chengju turn to face him. "You haven't visited the harem in days, and the first thing you do when you arrive is question me. Am I not even allowed to answer back?" Feigning annoyance, she stood up and pinched his waist lightly. "Since you're here, why not stay for dinner at Fenghua Palace?" At dinner, there was a particular dish that seemed to catch Chengju's fancy. It was simple, a serving of perch fish in a thin, milky broth. She picked up a piece with her chopsticks and placed it in her mouth, then smiled. "Why are you staring at me like that, your majesty?" Murong lips pressed together. "Since you entered the palace, I've never noticed you favor any dish. But tonight, you seem particularly fond of this fish." She picked up another piece and placed it in his bowl, her eyes flickering. "Just a little reminder to myself." They had known each other for years. How could Murong not catch the hidden meaning in her words? He merely responded with a smile. Just then, a eunuch entered joyfully. It was Jinsi, a trusted servant of Consort Lu. She set down her chopsticks and listened as he reported that Consort Lu was expecting. Chengju nodded, smiling gently, her expression dignified. "Congratulations, your majesty." Murong, however, withdrew his smile, his voice indifferent. "You may leave." Jinsi hesitated, unsure of what he had done wrong. It was the Empress who intervened, issuing a long list of rewards and exempting Consort Lu from making her daily greetings. She was always like this. Her face never betrayed anger or joy. So calm, as if nothing had anything to do with her. Murong suddenly lost his appetite and set his chopsticks down. She said, "Is this too greasy for you? If so, shall I have them bring some porridge instead?" Her concerned gaze met his, her eyes clear, filled with nothing but care. That night, as the Emperor and Empress lay side by side, they reminisced about the past, their hands entwined beneath the silk covers. She said, "I have sought many things in life, but the one thing I have never sought is your true heart." It was as if a string had snapped. The man beneath her slowly tightened his arms around her waist. The world flows like water. When the crown prince was 12 years old, the empress fell gravely ill. Decoctions of medicinal herbs were continuously sent to Fenghua Palace. Though still young, the crown prince already carried himself with great poise. He bore an uncanny resemblance to his father, the emperor, especially when he wasn't smiling. Chengju had never been in good health. During her time in the military, she had taken alchemical pills to suppress her monthly cycles, concealing her true identity as a woman. Later, she failed to properly recuperate, and after enduring the strain of childbirth to give birth to the crown prince, her vitality suffered greatly. Not to mention the old wounds left from her battles and the countless schemes she had orchestrated over the years, each one chipping away at her life force. The imperial physicians declared that the empress would not last beyond 3 days. Drifting between consciousness and slumber, she saw the emperor sitting beside her bed, gently stroking her hair. She smiled, too weak to even lift a finger, feeling as light as if she were floating among the clouds. Her time had come. Her smile deepened, and mist welled up in her eyes. Zheng is still young. I must trouble your majesty to take care of him in the future. She was bidding him farewell. Murong Ling tidied a stray lock of her hair and scolded her unhappily. What nonsense. You are his mother, if not you, then who else should worry for him? Cheng Ju's consciousness wavered. Your Majesty, there is something I can finally tell you now. Her voice was barely audible. The man before her furrowed his brows but motioned for her not to speak. I already know. She was never the daughter of some grand minister of rights. She was a princess of the fallen dynasty, the most noble of noble bloodlines. He had once visited Chang'an as a child, accompanying his father, and met the former emperor. He no longer remembered the emperor's face, but he distinctly recalled a Persian cat in the palace, a fluffy white creature with a large golden bell hanging from its neck. He had stood quietly in a corner, as per his father's orders. The cat trotted past him, its bell ringing crisply, and his eyes had unconsciously followed it. The emperor, seated on his throne, laughed heartily and said to his father, "This cat belongs to Yong'an. We named it Rongqiu. Lately, it has grown unruly, always running about unchecked." Later, when the news of the emperor's demise reached him, he had a fleeting thought. What had become of that pampered cat? On the night of their wedding, Cheng Ju developed a fever. They had shared a bed that night, and sometime past midnight, he was awakened by her murmured cries. She was trapped in a nightmare, her hands grasping feebly at the air, calling out, "Mother, Father." The fragments of her voice were thick with sorrow and grievance. Watching her weep in her sleep, he began to piece together fragments of the truth. She was the most brilliant woman in the world, yet also the one who endured the most suffering. A phrase of hers surfaced in his mind, 8 words etched into his heart, striking him so deeply that he almost found it hard to breathe. 10,000 miles of rivers and mountains, I will guard them with you. Cheng Ju closed her eyes for the last time. Her life had been brief, yet turbulent. A noble lady of the imperial court, a strategist on the battlefield, an empress of the new dynasty, and the mother of the crown prince, she had worn so many identities, shifting between them seamlessly. But who was she truly? Which of these roles was the real Yong'an? Life was filled with dead ends, and she had struggled and survived within the web of fate. There was nothing left to regret. She would finally let go, return to the earth, and reunite with her parents and brothers in the afterlife. In the end, Murong Ling held her lifeless body and wept. A man who had once faced swords and bloodshed without flinching now clutched his wife tightly, prying open her jaw, desperately pouring bowl after bowl of medicine into her throat. 7 years passed. A woman leafed through a collection of portraits before finally selecting the young master of the Jingzhong Marquis family as the future husband of the eldest princess, the daughter of Consort Da. Consort Da had passed away 3 years prior, and the princess had since been raised under the empress's care, though in name only, for the empress herself was often unwell. Years ago, Consort Da and the empress had been at odds. When the empress had fallen critically ill, teetering on the brink of death, an investigation revealed that an imperial attendant in the medicine bureau, who had prepared her remedies, was a spy from the kingdom of Yen. And Consort Da's elder brother had once been none other than the king of Yen, a warlord who had carved out his own dominion. For this crime, Consort Da was cast into the cold palace, where she languished for years before finally passing away. It was for this reason that the empress's decree selecting the princess's husband left the court bewildered. By now, the emperor's devotion to the empress had only deepened, and the imperial harem had long been solely hers. Even Murong Ling was taken aback. Though he cared for his daughter, the chosen groom was almost too exceptional, perfect in lineage, appearance, and talent. The empress simply said, "The grudges of one generation should not decide the fate of the next." Years ago, Consort Da's brother, Lu Shou, had desecrated the imperial tombs of the fallen dynasty. In response, Cheng Ju had offered counsel to the then Prince Jin on how to destroy the kingdom of Yen, and she had personally severed Lu Shou's head. For this, Consort Da had hated her to the bone. But all debts must have their accounts settled. There was no such thing as unjustified hatred in this world. Several more years passed, and the emperor abdicated in favor of the crown prince, becoming the supreme emperor. The empress became the Empress Dowager, though beyond her title, little had changed. Even her residence in Fenghua Palace remained as it was. Fenghua Palace was home to many cats, leading many to believe that the Empress Dowager adored them. But only the closest attendants knew the truth. It was not the Empress Dowager who loved cats, but the Supreme Emperor. Among them, the most favored was one named Rongtuan, often found napping on the Supreme Emperor's lap. Time flowed on until the 7th year of the Kaiyuan era. One morning, the Supreme Emperor sat unmoving, his hand slipping from his lap, a military tome falling to the ground unnoticed. The palace attendants finally summoned the Empress Dowager. Chengju, her eyes now lined with fine wrinkles, was helped forward by her attendants. She reached out and placed her fingers beneath his nose. He was gone. Calmly, she ordered them to inform the emperor and sound the morning bells, betraying no visible sorrow. That night, in the wake of the Supreme Emperor's passing, noble households across the capital burned lamps until dawn. As daylight approached, the morning bells rang once more, announcing another passing. Chengju, like Murong Ling, left this world peacefully. She had dressed herself properly and lay in bed, leaving behind a single handwritten letter. She had willingly taken poison, choosing to follow the Supreme Emperor into death. The emperor, now an orphan overnight, gazed at his mother's face and was startled to find a faint smile lingering there. Dismissing the attendants, he broke the seal on the letter. Plain white cotton paper, bearing the final words of an extraordinary life. She asked for a modest burial to spare the people, urged him to be a good ruler, reminded him to pour a libation of clear wine to the west each year, and finally, requested one thing, that he grant her the posthumous title Yeoman. Against all opposition, the emperor insisted on it. Whispers spread throughout the empire. Empress dowagers were traditionally given titles like Shao, filial, or Xian, virtuous, yet Yeoman sounded more like a princely title. Those who knew history pieced it together. The last princess of the fallen dynasty had been named Yeoman. And now it all made sense. But Chengju was no longer there to hear. She was laid to rest beside Murong Ling in Maoling, beneath a vast painting of the empire's rivers and mountains. She had lived a life that no woman had ever dared to dream of. She was not Chengju, but carved into her tombstone, only 7 words remained. Princess Yeoman, Shao Eryu.